This small form factor case works by using 0 axial fans and 1 cross-flow fan, which works by creating a lower velocity air movement at a perpendicular path tangential to the fan itself. The theoretical end result is a laminar, evenly distributed flow, and in this video we've animated it to make some educational material. But we also did some practical imaging of how the air is moving on this case with Schlieren photography using that setup. It's pretty crazy. We also did a full suite of acoustic tests in our hemi-anechoic chamber. And all this was worth doing because it actually works really well. We have in-depth thermals on it today, some acoustics and more, but even the mechanical side of this case is pretty interesting. Oh, the misophonia hurts. And now we get to the really clever part, which is the GPU and the latch mechanism. So this mechanical solution is actually a tab to pull the PCIe slot into place. Check that. That is actually like the coolest way to mount a video card that I've ever worked with a case. And it all works with this latch in here, where you can see this thing pulls that riser to bring it up to meet the GPU. And then a 3D printed plastic flange basically grabs it and hooks. And then the fan. So, case is pretty interesting. The cooling part is definitely where we're focusing our testing, because if this part fails, then none of the rest matters. But even the mechanics of it are pretty well put together. This video is brought to you by us and our brand new copper-plated stainless steel mule mugs with a shiny, hammered finish. These are in stock and shipping now on store.gamersnexus.net, and we haven't made these in over 5 years. But due to popular demand, it's time to bring them back. These mule mugs are perfect for your cold drinks and feature a laser-etched formula for the thermal conductivity of copper at approximately 26.85 degrees Celsius, approximately, depending on its exact composition and thickness and test conditions, but we're getting carried away. The point is that it's an appropriately nerdy formula to laser etch into a copper-plated piece of drinkware. These 17-ounce mugs are great for cold drinks on a warm day and are commonly used for mules, margaritas, and water. To help fund our in-depth testing and get some awesome-looking drinkware for your refreshing drinks, head over to store.gamersnexus.net. So this is called the Meshless AIO. It's a mini-ITX case, small form factor, and it has a solo designer. The designer emailed us months ago. We've had it since that time, and he's already been working on some improvements, such as to the fan. These two look mostly physically the same. However, there was a change to the hub on the fan, and now it's entering its final stages, should be ready for production and going on sale soon for $360, which is expensive, but then you look at the ITX case market and everything's expensive, maybe with the exception of a few cases like the Dan case A4H2O. There's really only one way to build the computer, as opposed to the N case, where there's a million ways to build it. This, however, it is very important to build it in that specific way because of the fan. So this is supposed to launch sometime in May, and it is expensive. However, it's produced in an expensive way. It is mostly one giant 4mm thick aluminum extrusion that forms a unibody. It goes as wide as a little over 5mm, as shallow as about 2 at the back, but ultimately it's a huge piece of aluminum. And since it's all basically one piece of metal, it doesn't need screws or rivets to hold it together structurally. This thing has very little flex, even when it's basically half disassembled like this, because of how it's built. The unibody is also finished with a lot of CNC machining to form these tabs and mounting points that allow it to avoid using a ton of hardware and screws, something that N case struggled with. There's optional parts like this ram fan. So this has some 3D printed components as a common theme, at least with this version of the case. So we'll test with that. Actually works, it's pretty interesting. Additionally, there's this flow guide, in theory, to help prevent recirculation. That's where our Schlieren imaging will come in later to help illustrate that. So here's how the flow path works on this. This only supports 280mm radiators, no 240s. The axial fans come off. That's by design. The air ends up getting pulled in as a result, again, of this fan, which mounts there. We've got a piece of foam down there, but it goes in here, and when the fan is spinning, it's pulling air in through the radiator. So the air is coming in, it is not being expelled here. Where it gets expelled is out this side. So this narrower slit at the top of this panel shoots the air out at pretty high velocity, actually, despite the overall concept of a cross-flow fan. That's because it's so focused and targeted. So it comes flying out here, and then as for distributing that air throughout the case, the interesting thing with these fans is that the air will pass through the blades twice. And that's by design, as opposed to an axial fan, where if air goes through these blades 2 times, you have a recirculation problem. And you can watch our BitPhoenix video if you want to learn more about recirculation problems. The air also is intended to come in through the holes down here. That hits the GPU. For the motherboard side of things, because it's just a sheet of glass, there's this tiny strip of fine mesh, and air is supposed to find its way in that as well. All of this functions on basic principles of pressure systems within physics, where you have positive or negative pressure systems, and depending on the pressure of the system, we get either air flowing in through any hole in the case or air flowing out through any hole in the case. And that's what our animation will look at as well. There are a few other places with holes on the case. So on the motherboard side, there's holes above the motherboard and the power supply. There are also holes cut out in the bottom of the case on the GPU side, which are meant to be passive exhaust holes for large GPUs. And with our modestly sized 4070 Founders Edition, they probably end up more as intake. All of the air converges at the fan and is exhausted through the upper quarter of the right side panel. But it would help to visualize this. And because we can't see air, the next best thing we can do is look at the air density gradient. So we'll head over to our Schlieren imaging setup. This is it. We're right now set up in front of a parabolic mirror. It acts as basically a lens to allow us to see the air density gradient change. So we're not technically seeing the heat, but we're seeing the change in density of air in this general region. But basically over on this side of the room, we have, I don't know, just looking at it, it looks like a mad science experiment that shouldn't work, but it does work. So there's a camera, of course. The camera is receiving light that's getting split by this razor. That's set up in front of the lens. We also have a very tiny but super high-powered point light source here that's taped to this tripod. And you can see an aluminum can cut out with a pinhole in it that is to help basically make the light as narrow and small as possible when it hits that mirror and comes back. We want as long a distance as we can get, so that's why the mirror is the size it is. Now, for the rest of the setup, so this is wired down to a benchtop power supply. We're running 24 volts into that light. That's what it takes. And I have some props over here as well. So this is a hand warmer. This is one of the tools that allows us to generate some heat, not because we're seeing the heat in the imaging, but because we're seeing that density change in the air around the mirror and where the fan's pulling in. Now, one of the problems with doing it this way is creating a propulsion. This pushes. And so what we do is turn it off after it's heated up that grill a little bit and just let the fan naturally pull the heat in. You can put it off to the side, up to the middle, whatever, a couple different locations, and pull the that heated air in rather than pushing it in, which would influence the result. Now, this isn't perfect, but it's a pretty good visual representation. Then we can measure the exhaust as well. But that one's pretty easy because we just run a heat load inside the computer, and there's your change to the air density. So that is the Schlieren imaging setup. Pretty fun. And this is the result. First, here's the exhaust side of the crossflow fan. You can see the air exits up at a 45-degree angle, which is great because it helps prevent recirculation of hot air in through the holes in the bottom or sides of the case. It's excellent design to project it up and away rather than just straight out. The flow enhancer is actually fascinating as well. With it on, you can see that the exhaust path doesn't change much, but it does better angle the air away from the case, and the other reason this works is because it instead is blocking the cooler air lower in the frame from being sucked up into the exhaust path and pushed or pulled away. This allows the air to instead find its way into the case through the lower 2/3 of the side panel. This orientation shows us air intake at the top of the case. When a hot object is held above the case without any air movement, the shifting air density is observable, getting pulled into the top of the case with a bias towards the right side or towards the fan's mount and exhaust. The currents of the exhaust also pull air in this direction. Using an upside down air duster, you can actually see this even more when we move the output towards the left. The air still pulls to the right. one side of the radiator gets a higher speed of flow here. We were curious whether the rear was acting as intake or exhaust, and you can see that it's exhaust. The air is flowing out of the case thanks to the video card's fans. There's some very slight air intake at the bottom left of the frame at slow speeds. It takes us a day to set up and capture Schlieren imaging, and we spent over $5,000 on all of the tools to do the job. So to support this type of unique approach to testing, head over to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our PC building project mats, our mod mats, our coaster packs for your drinks with PC themes, or other items like shirts. Even though the crossflow fan, as you'll see in our thermal testing, actually works pretty well in this case, it will not work well in every case. There's a lot of fine detail that has to go into a case from the ground up to make it work. So all over this case, there's finely tuned shaping of metal, 3D printed inserts, things like this, for example, which is actually goes in some of the cable routing area, but it can be removed or added based on if you need the space, and adding it helps with controlling the air path even more. So it won't work just anywhere. One of the downsides of this approach is that the GPU doesn't have enough space behind the back of it. So for modern flow-through designs found in most of the NVIDIA cards, they'll run into restrictions, and more on this in the testing. We wanted to take this opportunity to teach more about how this fan actually works, and also for us to learn about how it works. So this is called either a cross-flow or a transverse fan. Sometimes they call it a tangential fan. It's relatively new in the world of fans. It's about 131 years old from the first patent. The only case we could find that used one was the Cooler Master stacker case, and it was an optional part. Silverstone also made one for general small form factor applications. For the anatomy of a fan that's crossflow, so it's separated into blocks. That's these three large sections of blades. The blocks are separated by joint discs, which is these two on this one, and then one on each end. The blades are cross-sectional, and they're at a slight rotation, so they're not perfectly straight all the way across. This one also has a drum motor on the end, or an impeller. There are some that are duplex cross-flow fans, but this one just has it sitting on the end. Now, we've wanted to start introducing educational animations where possible lately, so you get to see the first one in this review. A traditional and simple axial fan slices through the air to scoop and move it in the targeted direction. Choices in blade shape and design can dictate how wide or straight the column of air is, but the concept is the same. Squirrel cage blower fans or centrifugal fans pull air into the center and then eject it outward along the blade path. This is useful in cramped areas to evict air quickly, like in handheld gaming devices or laptops, where we need to exhaust the hot air out of the chassis as fast as possible. For a crossflow or transverse fan, the fan is a longer and narrower cylinder that rotates longitudinally, with air entering perpendicularly to the rotational axis and being evicted from the cylinder tangentially to that axis.
So fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented.
Unlike the blower fans we normally see in laptops and some GPUs, a crossflow fan doesn't pull air in from the middle of the impeller. Instead, it has separate inlet and outlet sides across the entire length. The outlet is formed by this wedge, or vortex wall, stabilizing the air vortices in just the right way to create directional flow through the impeller. These fans are used in situations where a constant laminar stream of air is desirable without the buffeting effect of large axial fans. The total pressure of the fan is proportional to the square of its speed, according to research by Yongchun Shi et al. And research in 1973 by Eck et al. Found that a reduction in angle of attack improves the total pressure coefficient. Later research discovered a combination of tuning to the angle or curve of the blades across the length of the fan would further improve pressure. You can see this present in the modern crossflow fan used for the Meshless PC case. Its angle gradually swoops from right to left. Crossflow fans create lower velocity air movement from in to out and produce a laminar flow which gets evenly distributed across the length of the blade. You might find these in a common standing room tower fan, where the goal is to distribute air widely across the room, but not to direct it at a particular point. Crossflow fans can also be found in certain HVAC products, refrigeration products, and outside in digital signage and billboards. They've also been considered for aviation use inside the wings of planes, but the idea hasn't really gotten off the ground. So a crossflow fan has that downside. It's not going to force as much air into a single point as an axial fan or something like a blower fan. Some Jay's 2 cents style editing.
The captain.
We should leave that in. Shout out to Jay. Captain Jay's 2 cents. I like boats! All All right, let's get into the testing for thermals on this. So for variables, there aren't too many on this one. There's 3 speeds for this fan. We'll test all 3 of them. They're 100%. It goes all the way down to 45%, or in the middle, 65%. We are testing with the Kraken 280 NZXT cooler. We just bought it on Amazon for this review. The axial fans are mostly removed. There's one test, though, where we pull this fan and we instead install the original axial fans, but they end up largely blocked off. So it's not a perfect comparison, but it's an interesting one. The last 2 things we're testing will be the flow guide on versus off and the RAM fan on versus off. Let's look at the data. Time for torture testing with the full CPU and GPU workload. At 100% fan speed in stock, the crossflow fan kept the CPU P cores at 35 degrees Celsius over ambient, with the all-core average 3 degrees lower. This had it running at 37.8 dBA at 1 meter in our hemi-anechoic chamber. Conveniently, this is almost the same noise level as when we taped the 2 axial fans to it instead, which ran 5 degrees warmer. That's great news for the crossflow fan, but a word of warning, because this case wasn't designed for axial, the fans are blocked around the edges when held in place. So it's not really a fair comparison, but it's the most we can do without cutting giant holes in the case. We still wanted to run it out of curiosity. In other words, a crossflow fan won't always be better. This entire case was designed ground up for this solution, so axial fans will remain superior in most computer use cases. But when carefully designed for crossflow, our data here suggests that it's possible to produce a better result. The flow enhancer did improve performance from stock, dropping about 1 degree from the baseline result. It's not just a gimmick. And adding the RAM fan didn't change the CPU results outside of variance, but we'll look at the RAM temperature in a moment. Adding the seat belt boosted the temperature as it ends up blocking large parts of the radiator due to its floppy nature. The temperature increased over 1 degree from baseline. Dropping fan speed to 65% with the button reduced the noise by almost 10 dBA, or a perceived effective doubling in noise when going from 65% to 100% fan speeds. The temperature increase was only 3 to 4 degrees, though. Finally, the 45% result had it close to silent at 25.3 dBA in our hemi-anechoic chamber with a noise floor of 13.6 dBA. GPU thermals aren't as good, so this is the weak spot, especially with a flow-through cooler. The axial fans were actually the best here, despite being mostly blocked. The GPU ended up at 54 degrees for average load temperature with both speed variations of the axial fans, although the GPU memory temperature was slightly better on the 100% test, but within variance. This isn't abnormal to see, though. The GPU isn't in the direct flow path of the fans, but it is far enough from the cross-flow fan in terms of its path that the air follows that it performs better axially. This mostly has to do with the pressure system that's forming within the case. The first cross-flow appearance on this chart is the flow enhancer, which has the GPU at 55 degrees load. That's improved from 56 without it. The handle hurts performance again, with fan speed reductions obviously impacting it the most. The bottom 2 results see a hit to frequency, where the 45% result drops 20 megahertz from the clocks, not shown on this chart. This is a less favorable set of results compared to what we saw on the CPU, and we suspect that the design of the case doesn't do the FE design for GPUs any favors. There's barely any room behind the flow-through portion of the cooler, and any air that's ejected towards the bottom of the case has a strong likelihood of just being recirculated. This could be improved upon in a number of ways. One would be coming up with some way to mount the GPU closer to the outer wall, no matter how thick it is. The second would be maybe using a GPU with a more traditional cooler design where hot air is blown out the top and bottom edges of the cooler. If you get one with a vertical fin stack, that would allow maybe the case's fan to pull it out directly. The last chart looks at RAM and VRM thermals. The tiny RAM fan definitely does something. It's actually really cool to see. SPD hub temperatures on the memory dropped to 14 degrees over ambient when using the crossflow fan with the memory fan, which is an impressive reduction of 5 to 6 degrees against the most relevant results. The RAM fan had a small benefit for VRM MOSFET thermals as well. The axial fans otherwise did the best and were within error of each other here. Using the crossflow fan with the flow enhancer is 1 degree better than without it, but not as good as with the RAM fan. Let's get back to the case itself now and move away from some of the pure thermal discussion and talk about the fitment and how it all comes together. Features, for example, like that clever GPU installation lever. I hate rhyming. Since the GPU area of the case is closed off on all sides, the GPU is inserted from the back of the case as we showed earlier. This bracket goes onto the GPU, then the slots on the side of the bracket slide into place using these screws under the motherboard as guides. It works well. In order to attach the PCIe riser to the GPU, the Meshless AIO has that levered operating mechanism that we showed that lowers the riser slot onto the connector on the card. Plastic 3D printed guides ensure that it lines up during the process. It can be a little stiff to move into place, but it's a brilliant solution given the inherent space restrictions. For size, the case measures 379 by 165 by 259 millimeters, which is 9 millimeters longer and 10 taller than on the spec sheet. The rear PCIe bracket and case feet make up the differences. We think that should be included in measurements. That makes the outer volume 16.2 liters, well within small form factor territory, but not incredibly small. GPUs up to 362 by 78 by 163 millimeters are supported, which includes the massive Aorus Master 40 series cards. Those are the largest we're aware of, so everything currently on the market can technically fit. Obviously, do your own research to confirm and look for protrusions. As usual though, fitting in the case doesn't necessarily mean it should go in the case, and it's going to have more problems for thermals in the rest of the case too, because you end up with this massive wall that starts to block some of those really finely detailed but important flow paths for the air to get in and out of the two chambers. CPU cooling is designed entirely around 280 mil CLCs, and the bracket doesn't even have mounting holes for 240. The radiator itself can only be up to 30 millimeters thick, which rules out the Arctic liquid freezers. And the block can only be up to 56 millimeters tall, which blocks a few options. We used the NZXT Kraken 280, so we know that fits, but getting rid of the fans means some dead ends on modern CLCs with rat's nests of cables on the block. For power supplies, both SFX and SFX-L are supported, with the usual reduced cable management space with SFX-L. Some positives and negatives. We'll start with the positives. We like the execution. The Meshless AIO gives you a guided build experience with one final configuration in mind, and it does it well, and it's unique. Like we said earlier, the Meshless is more like the Lian Li Dan A4H2O in terms of maximizing one build style. If you boil it down to base elements, the A4H2O is the Meshless AIO's closest competitor, we think. The layout is very similar, but the H2O is half the cost and is manufactured completely differently. It also uses standard fans. We also like the use of integrated rails in this case. Internal components like the crossflow fan, the radiator, and the optional handle mount cleanly install with these. The side panels hinge into place with small tabs and secure with screws, and unlike the end case, it's way fewer screws. All these things work well. The 2.5-inch drive mount can hold two drives at an angle between the motherboard and the power supply, and it's secured by a single screw. Above that, there's a hook to keep the CLC's tubes in place. There's also a small hole in the rear panel below the motherboard I/O, so you can run a wireless antenna back inside the case. We used it for a thermocouple wire. There's a lot of thoughtful touches on this. As a last positive note, we value manuals here, and the manual is well done and helpful, even in its current unfinished state. The cable routing suggestions are particularly helpful. Now for some negatives. We've covered plenty of positives. So first of all, on the opposite side of attention to detail, the fan PCB that goes up here broke loose from its mount. Unfortunately, the approach that the Meshless construction used was soldering the standoffs to the PCB. They weren't secure, they weren't strong, they snapped off, so we re-secured it with screws. The power supply mount was another problem. It seems like the bracket's design takes the exact placement and size of the AC plug and power switch for granted, as neither of our standard test power supplies fit perfectly. The end result is that we had to force them to fit, and the power supply doesn't sit correctly in the machined area. This could be fixed if Meshless tweaked the bracket's design. We're also concerned about the power supply being starved for access to, we'll call it, fresh air. So the power supply ends up being one of the few components without a carefully positioned hole to help it breathe, and it's going to end up relying on whatever gets in basically over here, because the rest of it's probably going to get pulled away, since once you have that glass panel in there, let's not decapitate the tubes on the liquid cooler. Once that panel's in there, there's just not a lot of breathing room, and it's going to lose a lot of the pressure it has from that tiny gap between the glass and the fan, so that's the one area we think there might be more attention required for better cooling. We also found it difficult to plug the GPU power cable into our standard height card. Larger bottom cutouts would make this easier, as would a taller GPU or a longer cable, but especially because the connector positioning on the video card is non-standard, there needs to be a lot of room for flexibility here. Also, access to the bottom edge of the motherboard isn't easy. It's tolerable, but that's about it. Whenever a solo designer contacts us with a product they've been working on, we really evaluate carefully what the situation is and if they're ready for that level of testing and exposure and all of that. This is a serious project, and it is going somewhere. This is obviously a really unique approach to airflow in a computer case. Crossflow fans, again, have been around for a little over 130 years. They have technically been used in computers, but it requires that ground-up effort to shape the entire product around using it. So it's not as simple as just throwing a cross-flow fan and now it's a compact, reasonable performer. And trying something weird and different like Meshless did with this case is important, because if no one ever tries something weird and different, we might never find out as an industry that there's a better way to do things. And often we find that there are better ways to do things. And the crazy thing is that still happens in thermals and cooling, which seems like it should be the most uniform, figured out aspect of all of this. But it's not. And in this case, the cross-flow setup actually works pretty well overall. Now in the average case, and we really want to drive this point home because sometimes we'll see where someone tries something new in the market and the community will sort of run with that and go, everything needs to use this. That's not true here, because if small form factor case companies just try to throw in one of these fans, it's not going to be good enough. And even if you were to try and get a true like for like, for example, by trimming down this top part so those axial fans can fit better, it might be the case that actually it's not better, especially you start doing things like noise normalization, or you measure everywhere in the case, like if we were to add some measurement points in the power supply, which we typically don't need or use, but that may be a weak spot on this one. So this isn't an answer to small form factor cases, period, but we think it's a really good execution, and we're pretty surprised at how well it works, to where there's not really a problem of building it this way, at least with the parts that we had, the heat load we had. So some general positives and negatives. Real innovation for sure in case airflow. It's a smart execution. It uses an unorthodox solution. It's very expensive though, at $360 as a negative. It is, however, an expensive manufacturing process. Lian Li's A4H2O we think is the closest competition. It's about $155 these days. Very similar layout. Fans maybe notwithstanding here, but if you want something that looks similar externally and is more traditional, we'd point you that way. We have a full review on that one. The design is very focused with lots of clever and thoughtful features. We wouldn't be surprised if that GPU mount finds its way into competing products eventually. The CPU thermals were very good. The GPU thermals are passable. It's dedicated flow-through designs like the FE that we think aren't the best choice, unfortunately. And then for some improvements, the bottom cutouts should be larger for ease of use. The power supply mounting bracket doesn't work properly with some power supplies. We're concerned about the power supply's access to air, and the fan controller PCB broke off its mount. But otherwise, it's really clever execution, and we enjoyed working on it. Super cool, innovative, not prohibitively expensive if you look at the ITX market, but definitely expensive, absolutely. And if you want cheaper options, there's a lot of them out there. But it's not like it's some insane $600 solo artist project. This is like kind of borderline getting into mass production, mass market type stuff for the ITX world, which is expensive in general. But that's it for this one. Fun to work on, really fun to do the animations and the Schlieren imaging, break that out again. Please support that work though, because all of that is a ton of extra effort. We basically spent a whole day just on the Schlieren imaging. So go over to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our shirts, our mod mats, project and soldering mats, or coaster packs to help fund all of this effort to bring you in-depth technical reviews that are independently produced. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.